So, My Hero Academia manga chapter 345 has been officially released, and in this video, I just want to go over the potential matchups between the heroes and the villains that we see in this chapter, and potentially see how they could play out in the future chapters. And we'll talk more about that, but first, right after this. Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do my manga discussion for My Hero Academia manga chapter 345 titled Division. And when it comes to what happened in this chapter and what we are going to be discussing, we are mainly going to be discussing how the first phase of this plan went about when it came to separating the villains. So yeah, pretty much in this video, we are going to be discussing the matchups that we saw in this chapter and elaborate more on them. And we're also going to be discussing where other heroes that we saw in this chapter went and who they may be fighting alongside and against. So let's dive right into the discussion, because there isn't really that many differences between the official and unofficial translations this week. So for starters, when it comes to what happened in this chapter, for the most part, the heroes and the villains were separated into 5 different areas. 4 of the areas were only accessible through the Warp Gate quirk, and one of them is where the initial confrontation began. So let's start off with the original location where this plan kicked off, which is the area that is near where Troy is, which is 30 kilometers away from UA. And the heroes that we know who were left behind were specifically Fat Gum and Aoyama. And when it comes to who these characters are potentially going to fight, there is no concrete explanation of who they're going to fight. Because in this chapter, All Might tells Fat Gum that he needs to capture the stray villains that were left behind, as well as protect Aoyama. So, potentially the battleground of Troy, where Fat Gum and Aoyama are located, is going to be more of a small skirmish battle, where there may not be a big bad villain in that area for them to fight, or if there is, he's going to be introduced in that fight and is most likely going to fight up against Fat Gum as well as Aoyama. And before we get into more of this type of matchup, I will say that there is also a possibility that there are going to be a fair amount of Class 1A students here, as well as some other Class B students who still remain in the Troy area, because we do know that some of Class 1A were able to come out of the portals, and we don't definitively know if they were able to go into the portals somewhere else, except for a few exceptions. So as far as we know, certain students in Class 1A could have been scattered to the other 4 areas, which we will get to soon enough, or they are still here near the Troy area where they may fight lower tiered villains, or something that went through my mind, potentially Spinner. Because we did not see where Spinner was when it came to this reveal of who was being separated. The only villains that we know got separated that we knew prior from the original League of Villains were Toga, Dabi, Shigaraki, and All For One. We have no idea where Spinner is, but because there are 5 major locations and we've seen 4 of the major villains of this series in 4 of those locations, it is not hard to figure that potentially Spinner is here. And if Spinner is here, I think another member of Class 1A that is also going to be here is going to be Shoji. Because I do believe that when it comes to who Shoji is going to be fighting, it is potentially going to be up against Spinner, where there's going to be an ideology or an argument when it comes to discrimination, and the discrimination that Spinner has seen and the potential discrimination that Shoji has seen or experienced. But the difference would be how Shoji may not have incorporated or taken on that discrimination upon himself, but decided to try and grow from it, while Spinner just decided to let it consume him and allowed him to be more of a follower than an actual leader. So the idea is going to be that Shoji is going to fight Spinner and show that he could be a new leader or a new face to the individuals that have mutant type quirks, and show them that when it comes to society, that they may not be as fearful or as feared by the civilians because of Shoji, and how this could be the reveal that he's going to reveal his face, where they're going to be people that may be shocked by it but are willing to accept him. And if they are willing to accept Shoji, they are just as much, if not more, possible to also accept the other villains that have mutant type quirks, and that the fight here may end with a lot less bloodshed and the villains giving up, based off Spinner's orders if Shoji is able to convince Spinner to come to the side of heroism or to the side of the heroes. So yeah, that's what I think is going to be going down in the Troy area where Fat Gum and Aoyama are located currently. Now let's go to the second area where we get to see that All For One is going to go up against Hawks and Endeavor. And where All For One was sent by Warpgate was actually to Gunga Mountain Villa, the location of the former base of the Paranormal Liberation Front. And we see that along with Hawks and Endeavor, other heroes were able to come alongside him, which include Kamui Woods, Pixie Bob, Tiger, Shinshida, and Tsukuyomi, aka Tokoyami. So we have seen that at least some of the Class 1A students have been sent to fight against some of these bigger villains, and Tokoyami is potentially going to go up against All For One. Now, it isn't for certain that he, alongside the other heroes, are actually going to fight All For One. Most likely they're going to be fighting in the area and potentially fight low-level villains. But we do know that at least Kamui Woods is very effective when it comes to restraining people. Ragdoll has a very powerful quirk to manipulate the ground and the earth, so she can create golems as well as capture people as well. Tiger is just a powerhouse with his flexibility and is very muscular, so he can punch people extremely hard. And that same vein can also apply to Tokoyami, aka Tsukuyomi, because Dark Shadow is just nothing but pure raw power. And because Tokoyami has fought alongside Hawks, he may be able to fight All For One in the air while other heroes may not be able to. As well as you also have Shishida, and we really don't know his quirk, but potentially he has a mutant-based quirk, very similar to Frappy and Mirko, which gives him the personality and the aspects of an animal, and he looks very lioness, so he may have lion as his quirk, which will just make him extremely strong and be a powerhouse fighter in this fight. And that when it comes to what's going to be happening in this fight, I think potentially Endeavor is going to leave, where you're going to have just All For One fighting off against Hawks and Tokoyami, and that potentially Hawks could get killed in this fight between All For One and himself, and that Tokoyami would have to carry on with him and take into what Hawks did against Twice, and maybe Tokoyami takes the initiative and tries and actually successfully kills All For One. Now, I highly doubt that's going to be the case, but it is still a possibility. So yeah, going from Hawks and Endeavor fighting All For One, and Endeavor potentially leaving this battle to go fight and help his son against Dabi, that is another thing that we can talk about, because the next fight that we could potentially be seeing is going to be between Dabi and Shoto. And what makes it even better is that where they are is Kamino Ward, the location where All Might fell, where in the chapter we see that All Might has a sign on him that says heroes must die. And this is going to be a very doozy of a fight, not only because Shoto will have to face against Dabi, but something else that I didn't bring up is that in the area of All For One and Dabi, we see that there is a near high-end Nomu. And we do know for a fact that the heroes wanted to separate All For One and Shigaraki, but he also wanted to separate the other main villains as well as the high-end Nomu. And we do know for a fact that at least one high-end Nomu is where Dabi is and one is where All For One is. But we see that there are two in pretty much the last area that we see in this chapter, so I expect for there to be another Nomu where Dabi is and another Nomu where All For One is. And when it comes to where the heroes are in this fight, there aren't that many heroes that we know are in the area or in Kamino Ward where Dabi and Shoto are most likely going to have their initial fight, because the only heroes that we know are in that area would include Burnin as well as Kido. And Kido is the person who was able to redirect Endeavor when he was able to fight Shigaraki in the war by sending him upward, which is a part of his quirk. As well as we get to see Ingenium Ida himself. So potentially what's going to be happening is that Shoto and Dabi are going to have a starting off of a one-on-one fight with each other, while the other pro heroes are most likely going to take care of the other villains, and potentially we're going to see Ida take on this near high-end Nomu, because we did see in the war that he was capable of taking on a near high-end Nomu on his own, and how Burnin as well as the other heroes while the Nomu were escaping, were able to take out 3 of them as they were fleeing. So we do know for a fact that they can and are capable of taking down the near high-end Nomu. Now we just have to figure out what's going to be going on with the fight between Shoto and Dabi. And I think what's going to most likely happen is that because Dabi is just going to pretty much emulate himself and go all out without a care in the world, he's going to go full throttle against Shoto. But this is going to be a very different Shoto because we know for a fact that he has been training with both his fire and ice, and as we see in this one panel, he's able to release them both at the same time. So this is probably going to be a more evenly killed fight between Dabi's stronger flames, but Shoto using both fire and ice at the same time. But I still think that Dabi is most likely going to overwhelm Shoto, and that when that happens, Endeavor is going to come and try to stop Dabi as soon as possible, either by leaving on his own accord when fighting All For One, having All For One near defeated and then going to help his son, or it happens when All For One somehow is able to blow Endeavor away to where Dabi is fighting Shoto, where he will eventually interfere there. Because I'm fairly confident that Endeavor has to have a final confrontation with his son Dabi, or it could just be that Shoto has the final confrontation with Dabi and it potentially leads to Dabi's death by the hands of Shoto. That seems very unlikely to me, but it's not impossible, and maybe that's where Horikoshi is going with, the idea that Shoto is going to save his brother through death. So now we're going to get towards the more speculative part of this discussion, and it comes down to who's going to be fighting against Shigaraki, because we know for a fact that Shigaraki was specifically sent to UA, where they were able to construct a sort of flying barrier fortress so that decay would not be as effective. And an interesting observation about where UA is and how it's constructed is that it has a very similar shape to the city of Sokovia in the Age of Ultron movie, and if you make a comparison between the two, yeah, it seems as if that is where the inspiration comes from. So in this location where Shigaraki was sent, we know for a fact that 2 heroes were there, but 3 of them were supposed to be there, and that those 3 who were supposed to be fighting Shigaraki would be Best Jeanist, Dynamite, and Deku. But we already know that Deku was sent somewhere else where he wasn't supposed to, and we'll actually get to that a little bit later. But potentially some other heroes that are there would include Nejire, Edgeshot, as well as Mirko. And the reasoning why I say that is because we see those 3 characters in the same area where Bakugo was and where Deku was supposed to be, and we know for a fact that both Bakugo and Deku were supposed to be sent to UA to fight against Shigaraki. So that is where I'm predicting that these characters were sent to, and we're potentially going to be seeing them fighting against other villains or fighting against Shigaraki when we get a bigger and broader look at the area they will be fighting in the dome of UA against Shigaraki or just random villains. And potentially of these characters that could die, I would hope none of them die, but I'm putting my money on Best Jeanist because he's the one that has already taken the most damage among all of them, with the exception of Mirko, but it's Mirko. Actually, you know what? Mirko could also die because as long as she dies fighting, she can die happy and without regret. So yeah, both Mirko and or Best Jeanist could die in that fight against Shigaraki, adding a little bit more stakes and a little bit more weight to Shigaraki as a threat. And it would be very impactful if Best Jeanist were to die, mainly because Bakugo, the person that he looks up to, because Bakugo is there, and we know for a fact that Bakugo, at the very least, understands that Best Jeanist is a good hero and sort of kind of looks up to him. So that would be very impactful and could potentially give Bakugo a little bit more reason to try and want to kill Shigaraki. And speaking of killing, or should I say lack thereof, let's go to the final area where the villains and heroes were sent, which is apparently an aquarium where we're potentially going to get a fight between Toga and Deku. Because if you remember what happened in the chapter, Deku was supposed to go and fight against Shigaraki at UA, but was pulled through the portal by Toga's needles where he was unable to sense her with danger sense. And the idea about that is because he wasn't able to sense her because she didn't have any malice or ill intent. She wasn't trying to actively hurt Deku, but capture him to bring him to her location to potentially have a conversation with him. So we do know that Toga is one of the villains that were sent to this aquarium-like area, and the heroes that we know that were sent to this area include Uravity Uraraka, Tsuyu Furabi, Gang Orca, and Deku unintentionally. And the villains that we know were sent to this aquarium-like area include Toga, 2 near high-end Nomus, as well as a character from USJ called Hanzo Suden. And he's the fish-like character that we actually saw at USJ when he was in the water fighting against Deku, Furabi, as well as Mineta. So with that in mind, I think potentially what's going to happen is that this Hanzo fella is actually going to fight up against Gang Orca as well as Furabi, aka Tsuyu, and we will also most likely have Deku and Uraraka having a confrontation with Toga, and how that confrontation may not be violent at first, but may start off with them having a conversation and talking about what it means to be a hero, and relate that to Twice, where she may reveal that she has Twice's blood and use it as a bargaining chip to have that conversation, or she will transform into Twice and cause a whole lot of havoc, which will allow for the blood to come into the major plot and not necessarily discredit or make Twice's death less meaningful, and that is going to be used more as a bargaining chip so that they can actually have a conversation, and we may not actually have Toga actually use it. Or we could have Toga use it because she doesn't agree with the answer that Deku gives, or that she's in a mental state where she can't understand it, swallows the blood, activates Twice quirk, recreates Twice, and then just some really mental effing stuff happens, which will be very interesting, but I'm banking my money more on it being a bargaining chip than an actual thing that she's going to actively do. So yeah, that's pretty much all I can really talk about at this moment between who's going to be fighting whom, where certain characters are, and what they're going to be doing in those specific locations. The only exception is really Monoma, who has gone back to meet with Aizawa, but he potentially can come back and really go into any of the areas, but most likely he will probably go to the UA barrier and use Erasure to make sure that Shigaraki's regeneration and decay quirk doesn't go off. So we're just going to have to wait and see where Monoma is going to go. And that doesn't even bring up the idea of where Stain is. We have no idea where Stain is, but it was set up that he would have a confrontation with All Might, and potentially what's going to be going on is, while this is all happening, All Might could step away and go and confront Stain, and that could lead to his death. It could lead to him being heavily injured and eventually found by other villains where they may beat him to death. So we don't necessarily need to have Shigaraki kill All Might, but we do need potentially All Might to die, and if he does die, he dies in a horrible way, and I don't see any worse way of dying besides having yourself be beaten to death with no way to defend yourself. So yeah, that's all I really have to say for this. What do you think? Do you have an idea where certain characters are? Do you think that certain characters are going to play bigger roles in the story? And probably the final question, where do you think the students of Class 1A are? Leave your list of where they could potentially be in the comments down below. And if you want to see more content like this from me, either discussion, reviews, or covering the spoilers for My Hero Academia, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Manga Man Drew. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I will catch you in my next video. Goodbye!